So, this is the last day that we have together, and the last Teisho we have together. And I'd like to sort of bring together some of the ideas that we've been discussing and that I've been talking about for the last 2 days around this idea of trusting my life. Do I trust my life? There's a story from the Hopi elders, the Hopi being one of the indigenous peoples from the United States. And they're one of the things that the Hopi elders have said recently is that the modern day is moving like a very fast, powerful river, full of energy. And in such a time, it's best not to stay stuck to the shore. You can very easily get torn away and caught up. It's best to commit to the middle of the river in such a time. And what does this mean, to commit to the river? Do I trust to commit to the flow? Do I trust to commit to away from the shore, which is what I've known in the past, away from the shore where it seems safe? And yet, this is often where we get caught in crags and get caught under roots and can be caught in cross currents. So, what does this mean to trust to the middle of the river? To trust my life? And that's what I'd like to take up. Please sit comfortably. And towards the end of this, I hope to leave some time where we can actually work with this idea, do I trust my life individually as well? So we may have a bit of dialogue at the end around this as well. But I'd like to start with our original unity, our sense of what it was like when we were a fetus or a newborn, perhaps. That in that early stage of our life, there was an easy simplicity of connection between our caregiver and ourselves very early in our life. It quickly moves into the river, as it were. But this sense of having an original unity that we had as a newborn. Imagine if we stayed in that state, simply as that, in that simplicity. Every morning when we'd wake up, we'd have to reinvent the toothbrush. We'd have to remind ourselves who this person in my house is, and perhaps even, how to drive a car, what our career path was, and so forth. Language, color, every single day. And so we form a sense of self as a pattern finder, some way of keeping the continuity of our life going. And we put this in charge of how do we drive a car and how do we write a letter and so forth. And this grows into the sense of ourself. And one of the things we notice really quickly about ourself is it has opinions. There's a writer whose name escapes me at the very moment. I can picture his books. Bruce, I think. He wrote a book called The Master and His Emissary, talking about this phenomena where the self originally is a servant to the whole and is there to help handle the complexities of life. But really quickly what happens is that the self forgets this original unity and goes off deciding it controls everything. It signs up for things it's not even very good at signing up for in terms of controlling things like I'm going to control relationships. I'm going to control other people. I'm going to control how society or people are treating me. And its main objective is to keep things safe for the self, not necessarily safe for the whole. And what happens is like a career politician. All of a sudden, it sees its main job is to keep on getting reelected as the self. And there's posters everywhere. Look at what the self can do. And self is really good at that. And the self is just, paid your bills and things like that. And reelect the self today. it becomes about the self, not this original unity that we had from the beginning. It can even go into the Zendo, ooh, look how mindful I am. I'm a mindful little self, aren't I? Or compassion. Look how compassionate I'm being. The self has no bounds in terms of what it thinks it can be doing and what it puts itself in charge of. Mayuzumi Roshi talked about this in terms of, one of the things that we talk about in Zen and in meditation is that eventually as things start to become soft and translucent and clear, there's still a little bit of a witness left, just noticing things going on. And that's going to always be there. But the self can attach to that little witness as well, as a subtle little clever undermining of it. And so once we notice that, it can be very helpful to notice, this is another agenda that I have here, to be that little witness and letting go of that. We see this sometimes in large sessions and so forth, people who are new to the practice and perhaps they're working in the kitchen and they're chopping carrots very, very slowly and carefully and mindfully, and that self is being very mindful and so forth. And actually, when you're chopping carrots, just pay attention to chop, 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 chop. You can chop very quickly when you're just paying attention to the carrots and efficiency and your hand and the shape of each carrot. It moves quite quickly when we can let go of the self. The mindful self that wants to be in charge of carrots in that case. We see this in also, we see these newspaper stories, wonderful, great, heroic stories. Recently, the man who climbed a building to save that toddler that was way up on the 7th-story balcony. And of course, at the end, they interview him. And of course, he says, I'm not a hero. And he's absolutely right. You couldn't have had a self involved in that kind of thing when you're climbing a building, getting 7 stories up, hanging by your toes to save this toddler is just climbing the building. There was no self involved. He's absolutely right to say, I am no hero, because he was not there. There was just the climbing. There was just the catching of the baby. There was just the person who runs into a fire to save a person. There's no self involved in those types of moments. You couldn't be. If there was, it would be a disaster. We wouldn't be able to function. If you may recall, yesterday I talked about that description of Zazen, of walking a tightrope through a crowded marketplace with a bowl full of water filled to the brim on your head and a swordsman behind you saying, don't stop. If there's any sense of rigidity of self in that moment, it all goes to pot. So when it happens, it happens. We catch the baby. I am not present at such a time. And these are moments that, as we explore this, I'd like to suggest that are about times when we actually are trusting our life as it is. Trusting our life, not ourself. I mean, we will always be including the self. Again, we need this self, this pattern maker, this continuity person, this controller of events and so forth. But we can't let the self rigidify, let experiences become our identity, let emotions become who we are, and clump together in those times. So do we trust our life? Trusting our life doesn't mean we're trusting our life to keep us safe at all times. Trusting our life doesn't mean that we will necessarily have all the things that we want, and sort of that new age sense of like, I'm just going to trust in the universe and get a $50,000 raise or whatever it is. That would be quite a raise, wouldn't it? Trusting our life doesn't mean that we're going to be manifesting things out of thin air for us and for those people that we love. As we've been talking about during the sesshin, part of life is winter, the quality of all things, of all seasons. Holding everything, as we said, and winter and emptiness holds everything but keeps nothing. From life's perspective, the whole of life that is our original unity and that is with us all through our life, including the time of our death. Even our death is a natural step. And we practice our death here in Zazen, letting go of all but the ground of our being. I was recalling when I was 17, I was very, very frightened of death, and very frightened of every thought that there might be a disease that take me away or something. It seemed like such a tragic thing to happen, and certainly, it would be quite a thing. But in the I had this dream one night when I was 17 that really shifted things for me very deeply. I was in the jungle at an archaeological site. You know how dreams are. I was an archaeologist in the jungle, and we dug up something that contained some kind of disease or something like that. And one by one, people were starting to die. Not everybody, but some people just get sick, but people were starting to die. And I was, like everybody else, panicked about this, fearful. But all of a sudden I noticed that there were scientists among us who were still digging, still looking for an answer, still looking to find out what was going on, that were immersed in their work, that they saw a purpose in going on despite the fact that they might be dying. And I woke up with a strong sense, I want to be a scientist. Not scientist literally. Can't do maths, but a scientist in the sense of the scientists I saw in this dream, someone who just saw the bigger picture and was able to keep on moving without clinging to what was me and mine, and open into the larger story that was always going on. Trusting life means a deep commitment to the middle of the river. A deep commitment to the biggest picture of the self that there is. It's an interesting thing to go to the Melbourne Museum. They have an old section of the museum which contains all these butterflies and things that are birds and so forth. There was a certain time when a big thing for naturalists to do is to go out and find these beautiful, rare creatures and shoot them and stuff them and put them in so they looked half alive into museums. And of course, they are no longer alive at that point. In fact, Bill Bryson, in one of his books about this, says that some of these became extinct quicker, hastened by the collectors of these rare animals. But there's a type of clinging that implies about what we see when we see a butterfly. We see the pattern on its wings. We have to capture this and chloroform it and kill it and put it up on a piece of paper with a pin through its heart. Walking through nature, we often may notice this impulse. We see a beautiful sunset or a beautiful tree or a vista or so forth. And we want to stop and just pause at that moment. And of course, we should if we wish to. But what can sometimes happen, we can sometimes notice that it starts to become smaller once we stop and try and cling to it, trying to capture in our memory how wonderful this sunrise is, or how wonderful that bird is, instead of just seeing the bird, taking it in, and then letting it go, like the cycle of the seasons, like emptiness, which holds everything and keeps nothing. Often people will have, and they have their opening a kensho or deep Zen experiences where they have this moment of all of a sudden they realize something, and then they start to think about it. What was that? And then it closes right back up again. One person described having a very big moment, just hearing someone cough on the other side of the zendo, and just like her breath stopped, and she had this great opening, awakening moment. And as her rational mind started to pick and choose and piece it together and decide what it was, she said, just give me something before he closes up. And it gave her 2 words, let go. And that was all she had out of that memory. But she remembered that she had that experience. And that's particularly why it's good to go to a Zen teacher when you have such an experience, to help not hold on to it, but also to help deepen it and find its way and give it arms and legs in a way to use a toothbrush and so forth. Synthesize it, incorporate it into our lives. This sense of clinging, this sense of wanting to put everything in a frame, is the job of the self, to have an opinion, to try and make something into something good, to make something that's freely offered into something that's mine, to own. Part of the reason that openness can feel difficult as we start, sometimes it doesn't feel this way, but for many people, myself included, it can often feel very, as we start to open into life, as we start to feel our boundaries come down, as we start to feel the intimacy and connection we have with all things, a great deal of sadness can come up, a great deal of grief, a sense of even fear. You know, there's one of the earliest fears a child will have is a fear of falling, and that can be part of the experience for some people when they start to realize the nature of this boundless life that we have always available to us. So sadness and openness are very, very closely related, and very closely together in terms of how we feel them. Some of you have been exploring this very closely during this weekend, and this is what it feels like. The fear as we dive into the center of a rushing river. Am I going to be okay? Am I going to be able to keep my head above water? Am I going to float? It connects us as we open to the experience that all beings have. All beings experience this sense of sometimes we're going to lose people we love. We're going to have people who disappoint us. We're going to have people who don't love us back. We're going to have experiences of our own bodies aging and getting sick and dying, as the Buddha experienced. And in increasing our tenderness, increasing our openness to suffering of the world, we also, because as we enlarge, we can encounter more of this suffering, we also are developing a greater capacity to hold more suffering as well. So while it may feel like at times like we're heading towards bliss and Dalai Lama smiles and so forth, which are wonderful and part of the path, we also will be experiencing the fact that we can feel more deeply the pain of the whole world. And that can feel like grief and sadness. It interrupts the normalcy of the way we usually go about, most people go about their lives. Everything will be fine. Bad things won't happen to us as long as we do X, Y, and Z. And there's a strong sense in this normalcy that grips most of the world and sort of smoothing over the difficult patterns, the difficult emotions, the difficult truths about who we are, that in order for me to be alive, something else cannot live. That, and particularly if I'm living a lifestyle which consumes more than my fair share, a lot of other things can't live. And that's a very difficult thing for us to take in. So we'd rather not, in under the guise of normalcy. Carl Jung, the psychologist, wrote, "Our neurosis is equal to the suffering that we have been unable to face consciously." Our neurosis is equal to the suffering that we have been unable to face consciously. And so anything that disrupts our normalcy will sometimes feel like trauma, but it's also a way of coming awake, a way of coming into what can be difficult truth about who we are, but also the freedom, the intimacy, the awakening that is who we are as well, our natural born unity. I'd like to tell a couple of stories about this. One of them is a very old story, one of the oldest stories ever written down. And it's about grief, how feeling grief is as a connection between people. Many of you will be familiar with the Iliad, Homer's Iliad. And in this great story that's full of the passions of the self, for honor, for revenge, for vengeance, for being the best, and great war with thousands of people dying, all for the sake of jealousy over between the Greeks and the Trojans. There's one moment in the middle of this. Achilles, who you know as the great warrior who was immortal because he had been dipped by the gods so that he could never be harmed by a spear or whatever, he refused to fight. He had his honor. He felt that King Menelaus had ignored him and had sort of snubbed him. So he said, "I'm not going to fight," and he stayed in his tent while all the Trojans were going off. Sorry, all the Greeks were going off to fight in Troy. And his lover, or maybe his best friend, Patroclus, went in his stead, wore his armor, and went in to fight for his sake instead. And Hector, during the fight, speared him and killed him. This is the closest person Achilles had in his life, and he was so grief-stricken that the next day he put on his own honor, and he did go to fight, and he killed Hector, and he dragged him back to camp from the back of his chariot, and he declared he was going to torture and desecrate this body of Hector. Hector was the son of Menelaus, the king of Troy. And so that night, Menelaus disguised himself as a beggar and smudged his face and wore ragged clothes and snuck into the Greeks' camp at great danger and made his way to Achilles' tent and made his way into Achilles' tent without being recognized and clung to and came falling down in front of Achilles and grabbed his knees, which is a very, very humble position to be in, and revealed who he was. And he said, "I am a father. This is my son. We all lose people in our life. Please have mercy on me. Please, I beg of you. I can't force you, but I do beg of you. Give me my son's body back to bury." And Achilles, this is touching into this deep grief we all have. We have all experienced loss. We have all experienced the love of someone that we desperately care for. And we would do anything, including risk our life and our honor and our reputation by sneaking into an enemy's camp and begging our worst enemy for something for this. And so touched was he that both Agamemnon and Achilles just wept together and held each other. And of course Achilles agreed to send back Hector's body. So touched was he by this moment of grief. This is a softening into that sense of who we all are, the ground of our being, beyond our story, beyond our personal self-opinions of getting ahead and going behind. Something that captures us as we really are in our depths. There are so many stories that we could tell about this. The times of great grief often disrupt the normalcy and allow us to feel deeply. When we see refugees in the newspaper or on film clips or wherever, all of a sudden we realize these aren't just something that we read about in the paper. This is a person who has lost everything, maybe their family, in fighting, and come here in a desperate situation and just needs to be free in some way. This is intimacy with the suffering of the world that we all experience, and it can serve as an opening into who we really are. There's another story from India, that the story is that there's a great forest fire in a forest. Where else are you going to have a forest fire? You know what I mean. There's a great fire raging through the forest, and all the animals are trapped in this one place in the forest and can't get out from behind the flames. So this parrot who loves his friends, goes rushing is flying around trying to find some way to help them escape, but there's no escape. There's no escape. So finally, in his desperation, he runs down to the river and scoops up a tiny beakful of water and flies it to the fire and drops it. Flies to the river, drops it. Flies it to the river, drops. Of course, it's ridiculous. There's no way this can stop the flames. So finally, Brahma, in his notices and comes to the parrot and says, "What are you doing? There's no possible way this is going to bring any help to your friends. There's got to be, you're wasting your efforts." And the parrot says, "I'm kind of busy right now. If you're going to do something to help, please do join in. But otherwise, could you get out of the way?" And Brahma's heart enlarged in that moment and wept such tears that he put out the fire. This dukkha, this clinging to life out of the sense of the self, is the second note of the noble truths. There's the fact of dukkha, that life is full of grief, full of anguish, full of sadness. And the second truth is that there is a cause of this sadness, and it is our clinging to things that we are craving after things that causes this. This is the teachings of the Buddha in its apparent nature. It is in the nature of all things to change. It is in the nature of all things to pass away. But it's also in the nature of the human mind to cling. And that's what we learn, and we can see this. One final story I'll just tell. And I told this story last year, but some of you might not have heard it. And I love telling it, so maybe you'll love hearing it again if you have heard it. There's a story about Flora Courtois, who is a very well-known ancestor of ours in the Zen lineage, particularly in the Diamond Sangha. She was a student with Robert Aiken of Yamada Roshi and so forth. And she was also a psychologist. But the story is that, she was one of the founders of the Zen Center of L.A. And the story is that one of their neighbors, who wasn't involved with the Zen particularly, one of the neighbors there in L.A. where they were setting up the center was suffering terrible trauma, terrible fears, terrible anguish. And she just wasn't able to get out of the house. She was caught in a mental state that no one seemed to understand and no one seemed to be able to help her with. And so they asked Flora, listen, they tried yoga, they tried acupuncture, they tried psychology, psychiatry, and nothing was helping her. So they finally said to Flora, "Is there something you might be able to do?" She goes, "Probably not, but I'll try. I'll go and speak with her." So she goes over to this unfortunate woman's house, and the woman was sitting there in the dark, curled up in a fetal position, and obviously in great anguish. And so she sat down next to her and took her hand, and she said, "Would you like to tell me where you are?" And the woman told a fear-filled story of dreams and nightmares she'd had the night before, and how she was caught in the state of darkness and not seeming, to have a way out of it. And so Flora listened to her story, and then she said, "Would you like to know where I am right now?" And the woman said yes. And he says, "Well, I'd like you just to listen. Just listen exactly to everything as you hear it. Don't think in front of it or behind it, but let's just sit here for a little while and just listen." If she was here, she might have heard the gentle tick of the fire, the passing truck, the gentle hum here in the house. And they sat there for a long time. And while it's true that the woman became better, not long afterwards, I think the important part of that story was during that time, there was no problem. She was just listening to the sound. And this gave her enough space later to start to take up some other practices as well. Holding everything, keeping nothing. When we're able to listen without naming it, following patterns into it, having an opinion about it, trying to say if it's good or bad, we touch into the ground of who we are. Yunmen, the Zen master Yunmen, said, everything or everyone has their own light. If you want to see it, you can't. The darkness is dark, dark. Now, what is your light? And he answered himself, the storeroom, the gate. If you're a Flora Courtois, we could say the sound of a distant fire engine, the sound of a bird. And then he said, this is talking about this sense of clinging to something good. He said, it is better to have nothing than to have something good. When we are in the dark and we are trying to find our way, this is the way. Stay with what is at hand. Stay with this, what is not of the opinions that we have about it, but what is our actual life in this actual moment. The storeroom, the gate. What would you be willing to give up of what you know to know your life? What would you be willing to give up on the shore in order to dive into the middle of this fast-moving river that is our life? Entering the current, leaving the shore is a commitment of not knowing and trusting that the way of life is not to cling, not to put things in a museum of our mind, but to know things as they are. So, my invitation to you right now is to examine this. We're going to sit together, if you will. There's an invitation for us to sit together for a moment with a question. It's good to find some stability in terms of, and we've been finding that for a little while now. But we let ourselves, when we're considering a koan or considering a question, we want to find a bit of stability, but just enough stability so that we can invite the question in, so we can invite the koan in like we would welcome a visitor or an honored guest. So we're going to, when we have a koan or if we have a question that we're considering, like a guest, we're going to sit it down, listen to what it has to say to us, and consider this. And this, by the way, is a great attitude to bring to every single moment of our lives, not just koan. And in terms of working with this, the usual way is just to repeat the koan for a few times, enough times until it's really well established in you, just a few times, and then let it go. It's like you're dropping a stone in the pond behind here. You drop the stone in, but then you watch the ripples. And these can be your thoughts, these can be your emotions, these can be memories that you have. And attend and listen to that. Just the way it is, without judging it. The thoughts and emotions will rise and fall, and just notice each of them like you would listen to sounds. If you notice that you find you have a solving part of your brain that starts to take over, or you want to understand the koan, that's not a terrible thing. I mean, that's natural. But come back to your breath at that time. Just come back to your breath, come back to stability, and start again. Repeat the koan, and then watch the ripples again. So I'm going to give you a question to consider with this. And what we'll do is I'll ring the bell 4 times, and then we'll have about 5 minutes to consider the question. And I'll ring the bell again, and we can see what happens. Experiment. It's all right? Do you trust your life? Do you trust your life?